Hello, and welcome to today's video about CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. In this video, we're going to explore what CPI is, how it's calculated, and why it's important for both consumers and policymakers. So let's get started. What is CPI? CPI is a measure of the average change in the prices paid by consumers for a basket of goods and services. The basket includes things like food, clothing, housing, transportation, and medical care. The CPI is used to track inflation, or the rate at which prices are increasing over time. It's published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States and is a widely recognized and accepted measure of inflation. How is CPI calculated? CPI is calculated using a weighted average of prices for the items in the basket. Each item is assigned a weight based on how much consumers spend on it. For example, if consumers spend more on housing than on clothing, then the housing component of CPI will have a higher weight than the clothing component. To calculate the CPI, the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys thousands of businesses and households each month to collect data on the prices of the items in the basket. The data is then compiled and weighted to calculate the index. Why is CPI important? CPI is important for several reasons. First, it's a key indicator of inflation. By tracking the changes in the CPI over time, economists and policymakers can get a sense of whether prices are increasing or decreasing and how quickly. This information is used to make decisions about monetary policy, such as interest rate adjustments, to help manage inflation and stabilize the economy. CPI is also important for consumers because it can impact their purchasing power. If prices are increasing faster than wages, then consumers may find it harder to afford the same goods and services they used to. CPI can also be used to adjust wages and benefits to account for inflation. Limitations of CPI. While CPI is a widely used measure of inflation, it's important to note that it has some limitations. One limitation is that the basket of goods and services used to calculate CPI may not be representative of everyone's spending habits. For example, some people may spend more on healthcare or education than the average person. So they may experience different levels of inflation than what's reflected in the CPI. Another limitation is that CPI may not account for changes in quality or product improvements. For example, if the price of a new car has increased, but the car also has more features and better safety ratings than previous models, the CPI may not fully capture these improvements. Examples of CPI in action. Let's take a look at some real-world examples of how CPI is used. One example is when the Federal Reserve is considering changes to interest rates. The Federal Reserve uses CPI to help determine if the economy is experiencing inflation or deflation, and if changes to interest rates are necessary to keep inflation in check. If CPI is increasing too quickly, the Federal Reserve may raise interest rates to slow down the economy and curb inflation. Another example is how CPI is used to adjust Social Security payments. Social Security payments are adjusted annually to account for changes in the cost of living. CPI is used to calculate the cost of living adjustment, or COLA, that determines how much an increase beneficiaries receive each year. Alternative measures of inflation. While CPI is the most commonly used measure of inflation, there are alternative measures that some economists and policymakers use. One alternative is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCE, which is published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The PCE is similar to CPI, but it includes a wider range of goods and services and uses a different weighting system. Another alternative is the Producer Price Index, or PPI, which measures the average change in prices received by domestic producers for their goods and services. The PPI is sometimes used as a leading indicator of inflation because changes in producer prices can eventually trickle down to consumers. Conclusion. In conclusion, CPI is a key measure of inflation that's used to track changes in the prices of goods and services over time. It's important for both policymakers and consumers because it can impact monetary policy decisions and purchasing power. While CPI has some limitations, it remains a widely recognized and accepted measure of inflation. Thank you for watching today's video on CPI. I hope you found it informative and helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos on economics and finance.